The world is now witnessing the child of imperialist America, Israel, enact the last stage of its 75-year oppression against the Palestinian people. In this video, I will completely dismantle the Israeli perspective, and at the end of it you will have a clear picture of the cruel Zionist colonial project that is Israel. Let us begin. You will also hear testimonies from Israeli officials who will all admit the violent colonialist and genocidal endeavors Israel rightfully and wholeheartedly took to declare the independence of its illegitimate state. Anyone still on the side of the Israeli will feel ashamed after this video, since they will realize how the biased, one-sided propaganda from America made them victimize and love the oppressor and hate the oppressed. Firstly, the notion that Israel has an inherent right to defend itself displays a great level of both betrayal to humanity and ignorance. The oppressive treatment of the Palestinian population by the Israeli government is a mirror of the brutal, tyrannical, and oppressive treatment of Israel's imperialist backer and sustainer, the United States. When black people were oppressed by the government of the United States, by its white population, by the repeated police brutality, and a couple of decades before that, their unlawful and cruel subjugation by the white slave owner, and when they were denied citizenship, equal rights, and equal justice under the court of law, when they were treated like subhumans, mere animals that had no right to their own basic dignity, freedom, and security, when the white man sought to instill hateful racism in all of his institutions. Can anyone now utter such reprehensible sentiments as the United States had a right to defend itself, that the oppressor and the persecutor had a right to defend itself against the oppressed? Today, and over the last 75 years, the Palestinian people face similar, if not graver, misfortune and adversity under the Israeli government, since they were refused citizenship, denied decent life standards, but above all, they were subjected to repeated cruel subjugation by the Israeli military. And just when you might think that this tyranny imposed on the defenseless Palestinian people is just the cruelty of the military, then you need to wake up. Israel grants all of its citizens the right to bear arms, and there are innumerable cases of Israeli citizens bullying Palestinians with weapons and expelling them from their homes, lands, and farm areas in the West Bank. The channel B'Tselem covers all of this extensively, yet the world, in particular the Western world, is turning a blind eye to the ethnic cleansing underway in Gaza and chooses only to place its undivided focus and attention on the acts of Hamas, which they describe as being acts of terror. Of course, such labeling must be done judiciously. If the standards by which you judge terror and morality does not extend fairly to all situations, then you must abandon your moral reasoning entirely, since it has become null and void of any credibility, but also gives us a picture of the recurrent Western hypocrisy that has plagued the Western world and its people. When you call the killing of 16,000 people an act of terror, then why don't you extend that reasoning to the over 100,000 innocent Palestinians that were killed by the Israeli military forces, dating all the way back to 1948? And why don't you classify the massacre of Deir Village as an act of terror, where 250 men, women, and children were stripped, photographed, and then shot dead? Or the Nakba, where 75,000 Palestinians were expelled out of their homes where they had lived for generations and were left homeless with unbelievably poor life conditions, and the ensuing Zionist militias sanctioned by the Israeli government murdering 15,000 innocent Palestinians from the villages they sought to destruct in order to make room for the Israeli foreign settlers. These Israeli military forces destroyed, looted, and burned over 530 villages, and in the Palestinian people's destruction and immense death, the Zionists declared the creation of the State of Israel. This genocide isn't something Zionist leaders denied or tried to cover up either. The Zionist leader Ze'ev Jabotinsky wrote, "Every indigenous people, the Palestinians, will resist alien settlers as long as they see any hope of ridding themselves of the danger of foreign settlements." And also wrote in conjunction, "This is how the Arabs will behave, so long as they possess a gleam of hope that they can prevent Palestine from becoming the land of Israel." And lastly wrote bluntly, "Settlement of Palestine can develop behind an iron wall which the Arabs will be powerless to break down." And yet the Western media still portrayed Zionism as a movement for Jewish salvation, but clearly it harbors only its colonial character, as shown by the views of their leaders and its ruthless actions exposing its true colonialist nature. Not only was Zionism a violent colonialist movement from its inception, but it was a Western colonialist project more than anything else. The founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, wrote, "If it is God's will that we return to our historic fatherland, We should like to do so as representatives of Western civilizations and bring cleanliness, order, and well-established customs to this plague-ridden, blighted corner of the Orient. Of course, in the early years of the Zionist movement, due to its colonialist agendas and intent for the expulsion and extermination of the indigenous Palestinian people, it lacked the funding and support of Jews themselves, since they viewed such a movement as extreme, and so turned to the force of British imperialism to bring this evil idea to life. The founder, Theodor von Herzl, wrote a letter to British imperialist Cecil Rhodes, who was infamous for carving up South Africa for decades of exploitation and oppression. In that letter he wrote, "You are being invited to help make history. It doesn't involve Africa but a piece of Asian Minor, not Englishmen but Jews. How then do I happen to turn to you, because it is something colonial?" If the Zionist movement was really a movement of Jewish liberation and salvation, why would they seek an alliance with the biggest oppressor of humankind in all of its history and utilize their colonialist means to actually create a Jewish state? Therefore, Zionism is predicated on the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian indigenous population to make room for Jewish settlement. That is simply a fact. The Jewish general Moshe Dayan expressed the extermination and forceful slaughter of Palestinians his state was founded on, saying, "Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not know the names of these Arab villages because these geography books no longer exist. And also, there is not one single place in this country that did not have a former Arab population." And just as members of the Likud Party, the party of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, proclaimed that the war on Gaza will be the second Nakba, which will overshadow the one before. In 1948, the Prime Minister declared the war on Gaza the Second Independence War, meaning they intend to finish the job the first Nakba started to eliminate the Palestinian population entirely, either by forced expulsion or indiscriminate slaughter. And now, similar to the first Nakba, there are already 1.4 million displaced Gazans and refugees. Which ignorant, malicious person can tell me that this state was built on legitimate and lawful grounds? That with all of the state-sanctioned genocide in the aftermath of its creation, and in the creation of it, isn't colonialism in its most destructive, violent, and dehumanizing form? Not even black people were subjected to that kind of slaughter and brutality, since after the abolition of slavery, the military didn't actively persecute them and expel them from their homes. In conclusion, the Palestinian people and leadership should not condemn the acts of Hamas. If Israel does not condemn the war crimes and horrendous atrocities it has enacted on the native Palestinian population for decades and the countless deaths of innocent civilians, mostly children, whom their prime minister regards as being children of darkness. And before you say both sides are equally to blame since they both committed atrocities over the span of the conflict, let me ask you this. What created Hamas and Fatah? Did they simply arise out of nothingness and just happen to seek the eradication of Zionists and Israel? Or were they created out of the countless massacres and horrendous atrocities the Zionists inflicted on them in the beginning of the conflict? You must ask yourself this after hearing the description of these acts of violence that led to the declaration of the Zionist state. Which one is the terrorist organization, the self-proclaimed legitimate state that was born out of the horrific slaughter of 15,000 innocent Palestinians, the 530 burnt and destroyed villages, the expulsion of 75,000 Palestinians from their land or the resulting resistance group out of that barbarity and slaughter? What reaction do you expect when putting 2 million people in a small strip of land, ban the imports of essential items, restrict the import of food, deny them the right to leave and for their families abroad to enter, deny them decent civilian infrastructure and essentials needed for their hospitals to operate and function as to treat patients, as well guard that strip of land with military troops which are instructed to shoot whoever tries to escape without their tedious, indiscriminate process? This imprisonment some people call occupation, in which case it is occupation never seen before in that extreme brutality which has been going on for over 25 years. And if despite all of this you want to call the resulting resistance force a terrorist organization, then you must have pretty messed up morals or you are manipulated by Western propaganda. And this propaganda, which tries to veil all of this brutality and blatant racism, like their spokesman openly admitting that if 1,000 Palestinian mothers or one Israeli mother will cry, then the 1,000 Palestinian mothers should suffer among countless examples. And just as Malcolm X famously called for the oppressed black people to take up arms and demand equal rights and security, then surely the people of Palestine are entitled to the same, if not a greater pursuit. And just like the United States, through its unlawful and imperialist intervention in the countries of the Middle East to secure its oil interests in the region, and made its people think it was because of WMDs, which lead to the economic destruction and the deaths of countless people, like Iraq, which lead to the deaths of over 2,000 innocent civilians, and effectively gave rise to the ISIS terrorist organization. The same applies with Israel and Hamas, as explained by Israel's atrocities. Now we come to Israel's last act of tyranny, namely its complete disregard for the two-state partitioning, which has exposed Israel's true intention of wanting to illegally occupy more land for its people by allowing its citizens to illegally settle in the West Bank. That was in accordance with the two-state partitioning reserved for the Palestinian people, and these illegal settlements are also protected by the Israeli military, as well as arming these Israeli settlers and banning the use of arms for Palestinians in their own rightful state. Do you see this outrageousness that the illegal Israeli settlers can unlawfully settle in the last reminiscent state of their home reserved for the Palestinians under UN law, and the Palestinians are not even able to bear arms to protect their own state and communities against the rising settler violence? And it is in that state of the West Bank where most tyrannical bullying is imposed on the Palestinian people, again see B'Tselem, in the state deemed the Palestinians, by the corrupt United Nations and the U.S. This unlawful campaign has established Israel's true aim in wanting to colonize more land from the Palestinians cruelly and illegally. Of course, these settlements are illegal according to international law, and the Israeli government demolishes a very insignificant number of these illegal settlements every year, as to appear legitimate in the eyes of the world to still secure a significant amount of money to continue its ruthless campaign, over $150 billion, by growing its military and using that military to protect illegal settlements from the defenseless Palestinians in the West Bank, and further bully the Palestinians out of the West Bank. The Western world is well aware of Israel's colonialist agenda and its illegal campaign, yet it turns a blind eye, primarily because Israel serves as a pawn of the United States in representing and protecting its interests and values in the Middle East, in return for their funding. Without these funds, Israel would sink tomorrow. And all of this occurred in the aftermath of the peace deal between the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, and Israel, simply because the Palestinian entity in the West Bank did not enforce its borders by any substantial armed force. It failed, thanks to Israel, to give its people the right to protect their land by the use of arms, and so let the cruel Zionist organization infiltrate their land once again and bully and tyrannize the Palestinian people in their own native residence, the West Bank, which is rightfully the Palestinians as acknowledged by the United Nations after the two-state partitioning. Anyone who denies or asserts that the Palestinian people are not willing to cooperate with the Israeli government is an ignorant fool. Israel has no genuine intention of peace or a two-state solution. Rather, it has a desire to obtain more land and expel the people of Palestine from that whole region altogether. And because of Israel's actions, it has led to the radicalization, if you can even call it that, of groups like Hamas, who now, knowing Israel's true colonialist nature, seek its eradication. Israel, in turn, has never and will never be willing to exercise any two-state solution or lawfully grant Palestinians the West Bank and Gaza with complete sovereignty, let alone any land in that region, as demonstrated by its actions in the past and the present. This process of the colonization of Palestinian land and the extermination of the Palestinian population, the colonization of the Palestinians' last native home, the West Bank and Gaza, which was reserved for the Palestinian people in accordance with the United Nations and its international law. This colonialist campaign acts on two fronts. The first front is the genocide of Gaza, where civilians are being targeted indiscriminately in churches, mosques, refugee camps, and hospitals. And before you say Hamas is using civilians as human shields, tell me, from where do you get your source? From the Israeli government? Have there been any investigations on their claims, or are they lying just as America lied about the weapons of mass destruction that were allegedly in Iraq, so that they could invade the country and pursue their imperialist interests of obtaining the nation's oil reserves? The past disproportionate attacks on Gaza have already fostered controversy about Hamas using civilians as human shields. This state-sanctioned genocide has already led to the deaths of 14,000 Palestinians, half of them children, and the complete destruction of the last residents of the Palestinian people. The second front on which colonization is taking place is the West Bank, where illegal settlements are growing each year in number 700 million and are slowly pushing the Palestinians in the West Bank out of their land, which of course occurs swiftly since the Palestinians have no means by which they can protect their communities from the tyranny of the Israeli military and its illegal settlers that bear arms and push the Palestinians out of their land. The Palestinians are also, again, unable to protect the legitimacy of their state since they possess no substantial armed force, and each time they request it, Israel immediately orders a political crackdown on that political party or movement. The Israeli military has already occupied 60% of the West Bank, impeding the movement of people and goods through the territory. How does anyone look at these facts and still fail to recognize how bizarre and inhumane Israel's colonialist campaign in the West Bank and Gaza is? That the Israeli military even sets foot in a state that isn't theirs, inflicting tyranny and bullying by the use of the military and the armed settlers against the defenseless Palestinians in their own state, since they do not possess an armed force to fight this Zionist invader and its people in its state of the West Bank. And this legitimacy of their state of the West Bank was, again, issued by the United Nations and the United States in accordance with the two states partitioning in 1947. Yet Israel completely disregards this peace deal, at the full knowledge of the Western world, since America utilizes Israel for its imperialist endeavors of securing its values and interests in the region as articulated by Biden in the past, which is the main reason the Biden administration supports Israel. The director of the New York office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights describes the decades-long conflict perfectly in his letter of resignation, due to his organization's inactivity and its acceptance of the Palestinian genocide. This is a textbook case of genocide. The European, ethno-nationalist, settler colonial project in Palestine has entered its final phase toward the expedited destruction of the last remnants of indigenous Palestinian life in Palestine. What's more, the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and much of Europe are wholly complicit in the horrific assault. Not only are these governments refusing to meet their treaty obligations to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions, but they are in fact actively arming the assault, providing economic and intelligence support, and giving political and diplomatic cover for Israel's atrocities. In regards to the current genocide and the settler colonization of the West Bank and the apartheid oppressive regime the Israeli government has set up there, the director states, but the current wholesale slaughter of the Palestinian people, rooted in an ethno-nationalist settler colonial ideology, in continuation of decades of their systematic persecution and purging based entirely upon their status as Arabs, and coupled with explicit statements of intent by leaders in the Israeli government and military, leaves no room for doubt or debate. In Gaza, civilian homes, schools, churches, mosques, and medical institutions are wantonly attacked as thousands of civilians are massacred. In the West Bank, including occupied Jerusalem, Homs RCZ, and Yasin based entirely on race, and violent settler pogroms are accompanied by Israeli military units. Across the land, apartheid rules. Much like Malcolm X famously advocated for his people to take up arms to defend their communities and their people from their cruel oppressors, the Palestinian people should be entitled to the same, and protect their land and native population from its occupiers, and seek their right to freedom, security, and identity. The world must confront this apartheid, colonialist regime and hold it accountable for its ethnic cleansing and occupation of the Palestinian people over the past 75 years. The truth is showing, and Palestine will be free.